In less than 2 years of war, HMCS Haida would sink or help sink 14 enemy vessels. A British tribal-class destroyer, Haida was among the most heavily armed ships of her kind. And by the summer of 1944, she was fighting in the waters that mattered more than any others in Europe. On June 6th, the largest invasion in history had just come ashore in Normandy. Everything depended on the English Channel behind them, the endless stream of ships carrying fuel, ammunition, reinforcements, and supplies into France. If that lifeline was broken, the invasion could fall. It was after the landing that came one of Haida's and the war's most dangerous tests yet. German destroyers from Brest pushed into the channel, trying to break through to destroy the Allied supply lines. Haida turned to intercept. Before the night was over, Haida would be in one of the most important surface actions of her life. In the spring of 1944, with the Allied invasion of Normandy weeks away, every harbor from Plymouth to Portsmouth was packed with landing craft, supply ships, and troop transports on a scale that had never been attempted before, all of it moving through water while German torpedo boats were still working the channel aggressively, hunting exactly that kind of traffic. One of the teams built to stop these attacks was the Royal Navy's 10th Destroyer Flotilla, composed of 5 tribal-class ships, among the most heavily armed destroyers afloat. The 5 ships were made up of the British HMS Tartar and HMS Ashanti, and the Canadian HMCS Huron, HMCS Athabaskan, and HMCS Haida. For 3 months, they'd been operating along the French coast, running these patrols long enough to know every stretch of mine-threatened water in the dark. Of the 5, Haida and Athabaskan had been paired together since the flotilla formed. Commander Harry DeWolf on Haida's bridge and Lieutenant Commander John Stubbs on Athabaskan's covered each other on every mission and worked like a well-oiled machine. On the night of April 25th, intelligence reported 3 German Elbing-class destroyers at St. Malo. With this, all 5 ships of the 10th Flotilla slipped out of Plymouth in battle formation, heading south toward the French coast. When the Germans spotted them, they swung hard away, making smoke and running for home as fast as they could. However, when the Elbing broke west, trying to reach open water, while the rest scattered east, Haida and Athabaskan went after it together, pushing to full speed, leaving the rest of the flotilla behind. For the first time that night, it was just the 2 of them. And just ahead, the single Elbing smoke still hung across the water, its running lights out, the gap closing with every minute. At 4,000 yards, with the enemy finally in range, Haida opened fire with a star shell, and the burst turned the water ahead a flat, harsh white. Her first salvo hit the Elbing, rapidly starting a fire that spread along the ship's length, the flames catching and running until the whole ship was outlined against the light. Just then, Athabaskan steamed into the area, adding her own guns to the barrage, hit after hit, finding a ship already burning and losing speed. When the Elbing finally stopped returning fire and stopped moving, Haida closed to less than 1,000 yards and put torpedoes into her, then came around and passed again at the same distance, pouring gunfire into the wreck at point-blank range. The Elbing was on fire from bow to stern, her gun silent, and she was dead in the water. There was nothing left to fight with, and nowhere left to go. Yet, as Haida's own action report noted, quote, "The enemy came to life." By then, Ashanti and Huron had rejoined, and Haida pulled back to give them room to fire torpedoes. Then came in one final time with Athabaskan at 2,000 yards for a last concentrated salvo. Each hit fed the fires already burning, the white heat so intense it was visible across miles of open water, explosions rippling through her length as the ammunition cooked off below decks. Just before dawn, she listed hard to port, rolled slowly, and went under. That evening, the flotilla came steaming back into Plymouth in formation, battle ensigns flying from every mast. On shore and on the decks of ships already in port, men who had spent months watching these same destroyers slip out into the night and come back empty, stop what they were doing, and line the rails. In the entire history of the Royal Canadian Navy, no Canadian warship had ever sunk an enemy destroyer in surface action. Haida and Athabaskan had just done it together, alone, at less than 1,000 yards, and now they came home side to side, the whole port proudly saluting them as they passed. Only a couple of days after their incredible win, the 10th Flotilla was completely pulled apart, with Tartar, Ashanti, and Huron all being reassigned to other duties. Now only Haida and Athabaskan were left to sail. On the night of April 28th, the two ships slipped out of Plymouth into a calm channel, the water flat and untroubled. Moon and stars casting a faint misty light across the decks as they formed up in line ahead and turned south toward the French coast. It was a good night to be at sea. It was also, for two ships running without the rest of the flotilla, a good night to be careful. 8 British mine layers were already somewhere ahead, laying a minefield off Ile-de-Bas as part of a vast grinding preparation for Normandy. Haida and Athabaskan were the cover, assigned to patrol to the west of the mine-laying position and intercept anything German that might come out to interfere. A routine night's work, the kind they had done a dozen times before. According to the plan, the mine layers would finish around 3:30 a.m., and both ships returned for home. There was still reason to stay sharp. 2 Elbings had been reported off Saint-Malo, close enough to the mine layer area to cause trouble if they decided to come out. De Wolf took both ships to action stations as they reached the patrol area. 23 miles north-northwest of Ile-de-Bas, and settled into a steady back-and-forth sweep at 16 knots, guns manned, radar turning. The channel lay quiet around them. The mine layers were somewhere to the south, doing no work. All Haida and Athabaskan had to do was wait out the hours until dawn and go home. What neither ship could see was that the 2 Elbings were already at sea, and had been for hours. 3 nights earlier, in the very same fight that brought the flotilla home to a saluting harbor, 2 more Elbing ships, T-24 and T-27, had also taken serious damage. Neither was in any condition for another engagement. T-27 was the worst off, her hull stressed, her speed capped at 24 knots. Nonetheless, their orders were to stay close to the coast, use the shoreline for cover, and avoid any engagement. With the coastline supposedly masking them from British radar, and enough speed to stay ahead of any pursuit, they had every reason to believe they would make Brest before anyone knew they had left. Unknown to them, British radar stations ashore had been tracking them since just after midnight, 2 contacts pushing steadily west along the coast, plotting their speed and course with the unhurried patience of men who had been doing this for months. At 3:07 a.m., the signal went out to Haida and Athabaskan to proceed southwest at full speed. On Haida's bridge, De Wolf was leading both ships and had the plot in front of him, pencil marks tracking the German contacts, moving west along the coast. The sky to the east would start lighting within the hour. Going straight for them would put him at the wrong angle, arriving too late, chasing targets that would be in Brest before he could close the distance. He needed to get ahead of them instead, put himself between the Germans and safety, and force the engagement on his own terms while there was still time. The skipper altered course and pushed both ships to 28 knots, the destroyers accelerating hard to flat, calm water, their bows lifting slightly as the engines wound up to full power. After almost an hour, the contacts finally appeared on Athabaskan's radar, and she called them across to Haida immediately. There were 2 echoes, moving fast, still pushing west along the coast. Then the radar picture changed. Now there were 3 contacts, not 2. The third one noticeably smaller than the others, strangely coming from a direction that didn't fit T-24 and T-27, didn't fit anything the plot had been tracking at night, didn't fit anything either ship had been briefed to expect when they left Plymouth. On any other night, with more time and more sea room, it might have warranted a pause, a signal back to Plymouth, an attempt to work out what it was before committing to the attack. But the Germans were less than 4 miles away. The sky to the east was already beginning to change, and the geometry of the intercept was perfect right now, and would not stay perfect for long. Whatever that third contact was, it didn't matter anymore. De Wolf had them in his sights. When the range was finally right, Haida fired her first star shell, the round arcing up and hanging for a moment, before bursting open and flooding the channel ahead in sudden harsh white light, flat and shadowless, the kind that leaves nowhere to hide. T-24 and T-27 were sitting in the middle of it, caught completely in the open, their outline sharp and clear. They had no idea anyone was there until the sky turned white above them. Now, there was exactly one move available, and every man aboard both ships knew it. Turn away, make smoke, fire torpedoes, and run. T-27 swung hard and launched 6 torpedoes immediately, but in the chaos of the sudden illumination and the violent turn, she fired them on completely the wrong bearing. The weapons ran straight back toward T-24, which had to throw herself into a violent course change to avoid being hit by her own consort's torpedoes. T-24's own aftertubes fired as well, those weapons disappearing harmlessly into the channel. All around both ships, muzzle flashes from Haida and Athabaskan were already finding their range, shells falling closer with each salvo. But 3 torpedoes from T-24's forward mounting were already in the water, running straight toward the Canadians. De Wolf saw them coming and ordered a hard turn to port, swinging both ships to present their bows to the incoming weapons, the narrowest possible target. Haida came around cleanly, her bow slicing through the turn, and the torpedoes ran down her side and kept going. Athabaskan was 400 yards astern, her bow coming around through the same turn. One torpedo caught her on the port side before she could complete it, striking the 4-inch magazine and the wardroom simultaneously. Her propeller shaft snapped. Her stern broke away from the rest of the ship. The aft superstructure erupted in a column of fire that climbed into the sky, visible for miles across the flat water in every direction. The sea around her lit up a bright orange. She sent 2 words to Haida, quote, "Hit aft." The moment Athabaskan's signal came through, De Wolf was already moving. He swung Haida 90 degrees to port and began laying a smokescreen around the burning ship, thick enough to put a wall between Athabaskan and the Germans still out there. But his guns never stopped. Haida scored her first hit on T-24, then another 2 minutes later. The shells found their mark, even as the ship was maneuvering hard through the turn. De Wolf was shielding his sister ship and keeping the enemy under fire at the same time, because the moment he stopped shooting, the Germans could close on Athabaskan and finish what they'd started. Then T-27 came into view on the starboard bow, and De Wolf shifted his fire. Hit after hit found her, each one starting new fires or feeding the ones already burning, a large fire breaking out behind her forward gun that turned her bridge into a wall of smoke and flame. Her captain navigating blind with the rocky French coast coming up fast ahead of him. Now, T-27 was losing speed and sea room alike. At 4:35, she drove hard aground on the rocks off Pont Suval, her hull grinding under the reef with a force that threw men off their feet, sending them flying all over the ship, all while the bow crumpled against the rock, while Haida's salvos kept landing around her, each one throwing up fountains of white water in the dark. By then, her crew was already going over the side, everyone knowing T-27 would never move again. Behind the smokescreen, none of Haida's attack on the German ship was visible to Athabaskan's crew. What they had was their own ship, badly hurt but still afloat, and Lieutenant Commander John Stubbs organizing everything that could still be organized. The 70-ton pump was being dragged aft through compartments already ankle-deep in water, damage control parties working through smoke so thick they could barely see the men next to them, the stern sitting lower with every passing minute. Towing was still being discussed. He moved through it all, checking each compartment, pulling men back from spaces already flooding beyond saving. Though the ship had taken a catastrophic hit, she'd not gone under just yet, and as long as she was still on the surface, there was something to work with. Then the radar officer requested permission to clear the forward gun of its remaining star shell. It was a routine request, the kind of thing that happens at the end of an engagement when a gun crew wants to make their weapons safe. Permission was granted. The gun fired once, star shell arcing up into the night sky. Small arms fire came back from somewhere out in the water, from the direction of that third radar contact that nobody had stopped to identify when the engagement started. Seconds later, a second torpedo struck, hitting on the port side at the break of the forward hull, between boiler rooms 1 and 2. The explosion blew half the boiler rooms into the air. A blanket of burning oil spread across the water around the ship. The second half of Athabaskan sank immediately, taking everything and everyone below the waterline with it. The forward half rolled slowly to port, the mast swinging down toward the water in a long, terrible arc until it touched the surface. And then the bow lifted, rising vertically out of the channel, and Athabaskan went straight down at 4:27 a.m. The few men lucky enough to jump into the freezing water looked out into the night around them and listened. From somewhere to the north, they heard engines accelerating hard to full speed, moving away from them. Then there was nothing except the sound of the water, the fires, and the men around them calling out into the cold, hoping someone would show up to save them. After confirming T-27 was aground and burning and losing contact with T-24, DeWolf turned Haida back toward the position where Athabaskan had gone down. As Haida came around, the glow of burning oil was already visible ahead. She slowed as she reached it, pushing through debris and carly floats until her engine stopped, and she sat among a large number of men in the water. The sea around her was covered in oil, thick and black, spreading, with pieces of Athabaskan still settling around them. The voices came from every direction, some calling out desperately, others barely carrying across the water. Scramble nets went over the side immediately. Carly floats were dropped. Leading seaman William McClure, able seaman Jack Hannon, and stoker William Cummings volunteered to take the motorboat out, pulling away from Haida's hull and working through the oil and debris, hauling men toward the nets, toward the floats, toward anything they could hold on to. But the situation around Haida was deteriorating by the minute, and DeWolf knew exactly how fast. The drift was carrying his ship toward a German minefield. The enemy coast was 5 minutes away. Shore batteries on that coast were within range of where Haida was sitting, stopped in the water, her engines cold, her nets over the side, everything about her screaming target to anyone watching from shore. Dawn was coming, and German aircraft would not be far behind. A stopped destroyer with men in the water around her was exactly the kind of target that would not survive the morning light. Every calculation pointed the same way. Every minute the net stayed down was another man pulled from the water, and another minute closer to losing Haida and everyone aboard her. DeWolf stayed, nonetheless. From the water below, Athabaskan's own captain called out to him. Stubbs was still alive, treading water somewhere beneath Haida's hull, telling DeWolf to go, to get Haida clear while there was still time. Stubbs understood the calculation as well as anyone on that bridge. He'd already lost one ship that night, and he was not going to be responsible for losing another. His own life was part of what he was asking DeWolf to leave behind, and he was asking anyway. DeWolf stayed for 18 minutes, far longer than any reasonable assessment of the risk could justify, longer than the minefield and the coast and the coming dawn said he should, the nets over the side and the motorboat still working through the water below, pulling men in one by one. From up on the bridge, he could not see the faces of the men he was leaving behind. That was the only reason he could give the order. The nets came up. The engines went slow ahead, then faster, and Haida accelerated to 31 knots, turning north toward Plymouth, leaving the burning water behind her. She had 42 survivors aboard. Behind her, still in the water, were the men she could not reach. Among them was Bill Connolly, who'd been swimming toward Haida when her engine started. Despite only being 20 feet from the hull, he could do nothing but watch as the ship left him behind. On the morning of April 29th, Haida passed through Plymouth Gate, flying her battle ensign, the same way she and Athabaskan had come home together 3 nights earlier after sinking T-29, ships lining their rails to salute them. This time, there was only one ship to salute. She moved slowly up the harbor, the space where Athabaskan should have been, astern of her, empty, and the crews watching from the docks and the decks of other vessels understood without being told what that space meant. The work waiting for Haida's crew when she tied up was the kind of work that doesn't stop for grief. The magazines had to be restocked, the ship made ready again, the necessary grinding business of putting a warship back in fighting condition carried out, regardless of what the men doing it were feeling. After a night at action stations, after everything seen and done in the hours since leaving Plymouth, Haida's crew faced the prospect of that work with the particular exhaustion of people who have nothing left. The job was already done. Huron's crew had shown up while Haida was still at sea and started working, and when Haida's men came down to the magazines, the volunteers from the sister ship were already there, insisting on finishing the job themselves. Huron was sitting in dry dock a few hundred yards away, her hull damaged, unable to sail, unable to fight, unable to do anything that mattered, in the way that destroyers in the Channel in April 1944 was supposed to matter. So she had sent her men to do the one thing she still could. It was the only thing left to give, and she gave it. What had fired that second torpedo was never conclusively established. The third radar contact, the one nobody had stopped to identify when the geometry of the intercept was perfect and the sky was about to lighten, was never explained to anyone's satisfaction. Some believed it was a German motor torpedo boat running close to the coast. Others were sure it was some kind of freak-friendly fire incident. What was certain was that something had been out there that night, something that nobody had stopped to ask about, and Athabaskan's 128 men had paid the price for that unanswered question. On June 6, 1944, the largest invasion in history came ashore on the beaches of Normandy. The minefields had been laid, the convoys had gone through, and the months of night operations along the French coast had done their work. 2 days later, German destroyers from Brest pushed into the Channel, trying to reach the Allied supply lines, and Haida and Huron were there to meet them. Huron and Haida chased Z-32, the German flotilla leader, across half the Channel, through waters sown with mines they were forbidden to enter, closing the distance mile by mile until she had nowhere left to go. At dawn, Z-32 drove onto the rocks off Île-de-Bas, the same stretch of French coastline where T-27 had gone aground on the night Athabaskan sank. De Wolf stood on Haida's bridge and watched her burn. 3 weeks later, Haida hunted down U-971, a submarine that had been lying motionless on the seabed for 2 hours, trying to pass itself off as a wreck. 9 depth charge attacks later, her crew abandoned ship. Haida pulled 53 of the 54 men from the water. HMS Black Prince signaled afterward. Narviks, Elbings, and submarines all seemed to come alike. In September, De Wolf left after 14 months in command, the most decorated naval officer the Royal Canadian Navy produced in the entire war. When Germany surrendered, Haida had been in commission for less than 2 years, had sunk or helped sink 14 enemy vessels, and every Royal Navy ship in Portsmouth put its crew on deck and gave her 3 cheers. The Korean War brought Haida back to the forefront of shore bombardment and train busting, hunting North Korean supply trains along the coast at night. During the conflict, Haida was led by a commanding officer named Undone who had been Athabaskan's radar officer on the night she sank, spent the last year of the war as a German prisoner, and came back 8 years later to take command of the ship that couldn't save him. After 20 years of service, 2 wars, and more than 250,000 miles steamed, Haida's white ensign came down for the last time in October 1963. The last tribal-class destroyer left in the world, the only one of 27 still afloat, and the fightingest ship in the Royal Canadian Navy.